So I want to start with the beginning of what you said, which I want to take sharp issue with, which is, of course, what's exciting in a conversation, right? Which is, I'm not suggesting that war is an inevitable part of human nature. I think it's not. And so I think we can get to a place where we move beyond war. So I want to try and talk, because I think that's like insanely important. Sacrifice is an inherent dimension of human nature.
Welcome to Parallax, the resurrection of truth, beauty, and goodness. Parallax, a media war engine. Parallax, the construction amidst eternal decay. Parallax, the portal to the edge of chaos. Parallax, poem and provocation. Parallax, mad philosophers and tantric demigods. Parallax, totem for an unknown god. Parallax, philosophy and the return of the matriarch. Parallax, the end of the meaning crisis. Parallax, the whispering daemon in your ear. Parallax, the god of wisdom, wine and love. Parallax, your home for superior publications, podcasts and courses. Parallax, join us today.
Okay, so welcome to the Parallax podcast. I'm your host. My name is Thomas Mark. With me today is Dr. Marc Gafni. Welcome to the podcast, sir.
Great that you're here. Tom. It's good to be with you, my friend.
Okay, so just to set this up a little bit, for some moments, I had some very interesting conversations about the topic of war with Alexander Barth, with Thomas Hammerich, and with Jim Rudd, focusing on different aspects of war. From a psychological perspective, from a more systemic perspective. I'm drawn to a way to frame or to understand war from a more spiritual side. So what I'm trying to do is to find the right framing about the nature of reality and the nature of self, right? And in terms of war, of conflict, of time, of evolution, because as soon as we introduce all these topics, we are introducing conflict, we introducing change, we're introducing nature that is kind of in conflict with itself. And so we always have, when we talk about spirituality, we talk about unified consciousness, we're talking about transcendence. We seldom talk about evolution. We seldom talk about conflict, and in the last iteration about war.
Thank you, Tom. So maybe a couple of things, just a personal thing, which is I would in general be very hesitant. You wrote me about this, and I responded with a yes, just in a deep sense of trusting, you and your personhood, right? It's not a topic that one would lightly say yes to in most contexts, right. Because it is a topic that can create war itself, right? It's a very, very painful and difficult topic. Both of my sons, in the last, couple of years have been directly involved as commanders of commandos, right? In, direct, armed conflicts. Both of my sons have been injured, right? In other words, I know I've buried many students, right? Not one or two, right? Over the years, who have been 18 and 19 years old, who have died in war. And the nature of a student who goes to war is that the student is trained to kill, right? I mean, so this is not a topic that for me is distant in any sense. I served in the Army. One of the things people don't know about me is that I'm very, very familiar with firearms. Of course, I brought down the average level of skill of the Army that I served in dramatically just by me participating in it. And as the average level of competence and skill in all levels went way down, right? And, perhaps, that's, would account for many of the, complex geopolitical movements there. But that's just to say the topic is, it's a topic before which I tremble. Right? This is a topic we can't not but tremble. So with permission, Tom, let me maybe riff for a couple of minutes and then pass it back to you and just try and feel our way into it. Is that okay?
Awesome.
Okay. So I want to introduce a term which I've been thinking about for about 30 years. And I wrote myself a whole set of notes about it 30 years ago. And it's one of those things that I wrote about and then didn't complete, and I've come back to quite intentionally in the last really several months, thinking about, life and death and war. And the topic is sacrifice. Sacrifice. This notion of sacrificial action at the very heart of reality. And it's a strange door. It's a door that we don't find our way in. But when you think about it very deeply, you feel very deeply into it. You remember, at a certain point in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, there was an enormous discussion in the world about what the primary human drive is, and Freud had to say what he had to say, and Alfred Adler had to say what he had to say. And, right after World War II, Viktor Frankl and the third school of Viennese, psychotherapy, logotherapy had to say what he had to say, and, et cetera, and the different shades of Nietzsche on different days, both edited by his sister and unedited by his sister, had to say what they had to say. But underneath it all, there is and to use a word that you've written about, there's a will to sacrifice. And that's very deep. And the will to sacrifice is not an accident of cosmos. It is, and I've never talked about it really publicly before, because it's such a fraught, in English, it's such a sensitive topic. There's a will to sacrifice. And when there's a fundamental drive, the human being has a drive to sacrifice themselves. There's a will to sacrifice. And when we don't meet a will to sacrifice in a way that's authentic, then it emerges inauthentically. It emerges in it. So just like there's a core sensual drive in the world, Freud was right about libido. He was wrong about the downgrading of libido to just sex. Actually, libido needs to be upgraded to eros. So it was a reverse direction. But he got, so once you realize there's a legitimate drive towards eros, you realize that the degradations of eros, will emerge as, the worst versions of Pornhub, right? Because if you don't have an erotic universe, you're going to generate a pornographic universe, which will be either the pseudo-eros or the anti-eros of the original. The pseudo imitates, right, eros, but then you'll get anti-eros, and anti-eros will be torture. Right? The movement of torture is an anti-erotic movement. It's not just pseudo-erotic, it's anti-erotic. So there's pseudo-value, there's value, pseudo-value, anti-value. There's eros, pseudo-eros, anti-eros. So there's authentic sacrifice, there's pseudo-sacrifice, and there's like this anti-sacrifice. And it's very deep. So if I don't actually honor the will to sacrifice, which appears in every dimension of my humanity, then my sacrifice will turn into the degradations of wars that shouldn't be fought. So I want to go just a little more on the riff, then it's back to, it's deep. When I say the degradations of wars that shouldn't be fought, I'm making an implicit assertion, which is that there are some wars that should be fought, right? Meaning I'm rejecting pacifism, right, as a principled position that can be taken today in realpolitik. I was in the Dalai Lama's, back room at his home in Dharamsala with him, and he said to me, pacifism, haha, people say I'm pacifist. Pacifism, stupid, not moral, right? In other words, his point was that there are moments when wars need to be fought, because what we're saying is, and it's hard to say without crying, but what we're saying is we have a realization of the multidimensionality of reality, and it's worth sacrificing myself in this dimension for the sake of the larger whole. That's what a hero is, right? A hero says, I have this experience. The hero is almost enlightened in their very essence. The genuine hero, right, has this experience of the larger whole and is willing to sacrifice for the larger whole. If people who are listening don't have direct access to war, and I hope you don't, go to the movies. Just go to the, the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, that one of those movies at the end of the 20th century that you can get on, Amazon Prime, and you see these boys from, Normandy and, and Idaho, Idaho and upstate New York and Montana and Great Britain flooding the beaches of Normandy, right? I mean, what does that even mean, right? It's where they're fighting, and then you hear about, the circles of German resistance and the people who were killed, right? Germans trying to kill Hitler, right? Who gave up their lives, right? Trying to take down the Third Reich from within Germany, right? So these people gave their lives up, right? They sacrificed their lives, right? For a larger value. And how did I move to Israel? I moved to Israel knowing that my children would serve in the Israel Defense Forces, which is a horror. How can you move to a country where you know that your child is going to pick up a weapon that's designed to kill, right? And yet, we needed the German resistance to resist Hitler and the collaborations that took place behind the scenes between the German resistance and the Allies. And we needed to take Hitler down, right? And we needed to sacrifice our lives to do it. So we all recognize it's deep that actually the sacrificial act, or what I might call sacrificial reciprocity, right, in the covenant between generations, right, is the core of human reality. There's a sacrificial reciprocity, which is the ground of a covenant between generations. Right? It's not a covenant between the human being and God, right? It's a covenant between the generations themselves, right? In this multi-dimensional reality. And that sacrifice. And maybe one last sentence, and then, and thank you for your patience just in opening up, is it's so deep. The original word in Hebrew and Aramaic, but let's go with the Hebrew, for radical intimacy is a 3-letter root, kuf, resh, beit, korban, karov, and it means radically intimate, kirva, and it means korban, sacrifice. So the word for radical intimacy in the original ancient Hebraic and Aramaic texts, and the word for radical sacrifice, radical intimacy, radical sacrifice, are the same word, because there is no intimacy without a sacrificial act. And we can expand this, right, enormously, right? In other words, but I mean, just to say maybe 2 more words, right? Every conversation is a sacrificial act. So your willingness to listen to me in these 7 minutes is a sacrificial act, right? Right? That's a sacrificial. We listen to each other, right? Is it when we engage in a conversation, as I listen to Tom, it's a sacrificial act. And I'm not thinking when I'm listening to Tom about what I'm going to say, I'm actually listening to him. And then if I'm willing to take Tom's perspective in a conversation, that's an even deeper sacrificial act, a second level of sacrifice. And a third level of sacrifice, I'm willing to actually be transformed by Tom's perspective, right? Right? Sexuality, right, is at some point, the one who's not willing to engage in the sacrificial act in sexuality, right, is engaged in hedonic manipulation, right? And I invite my partner, after all the witnesses are gone, to witness my sacrifice. And it's deep, right? All learning, developmental theory, is about stages of sacrifice. You can't actually understand developmental theory, right, without stages of sacrifice. So war is ultimately tragic, but it becomes post-tragic, if I can use a nomenclature that's important to me. We move, right? When we say there's no sacrifice, we're in pre-tragic. When we recognize that we live in a veil of tears, and that there's value for which we must sacrifice, we move, right? We recognize the tragic. When we learn to discern between right causes and false causes, we learn noble sacrifice, right? The eros of sacrifice. Then we begin to move towards the post-tragic, and we reach together to a world in which sacrifice becomes only intellectual sacrifice, only spiritual sacrifice, only emotional sacrifice, right? And no longer is the sacrifice of the pierced body. So a little bit.
All right. Okay. So there's a lot to unpack, and I completely agree. It's a very, very complicated topic, war in itself, because it belongs to the most horrific and devastating experiences of, yeah, well, of human existence itself. And, you know, we just had the Age of Enlightenment and the 20th century, which kind of belonged to the most savage, most wild and devastating centuries that we had. And so the question then is, so how do we deal with war, you know, in a way that pays due to the fact that it seems to be an intrinsic part of human existence itself, right?
So I want to start with the beginning of what you said, which I want to take sharp issue with, which is, of course, what's exciting in a conversation, right? Which is, I'm not suggesting that war is an inevitable part of human nature. I think it's not. And so I think we can get to a place where we move beyond war. So I want to try and talk, because I think that's like insanely important. Sacrifice is an inherent dimension of human nature. And when sacrifice is not honored, when we don't offer sacrifice at the altar of sacrifice itself, when sacrifice doesn't have its right place, so then pseudo-sacrifice, right, sacrificing for the wrong cause, or anti-sacrifice is Sauron. Sauron in Lord of the Rings is anti. He's not just pseudo-sacrifice, he's anti-sacrifice. The slaughter, right, of Genghis Khan, right, the unnecessary slaughter, right, the kind of reveling, the revelry in slaughter is anti-sacrifice, but it begins with a kind of exponentialized degradation of pseudo-sacrifice. So we have to actually try and, so sacrifice needs to, there's an evolution of sacrifice. War in its degraded forms, right, becomes, right, pseudo or anti-sacrifice. War in its noble forms at the right time and right place emerges from, and here let's go slow, a recognition that the field of value, which is the whole, is multi-dimensional and therefore demands in one dimension sacrifice for the sake of the whole. So that's what we have on the table. Now let's move from that to what you said, Tom, which is, okay, now, is sacrifice an inherent part of is war an inherent part of reality, which is unavoidable? So
And
I think
sacrifice, you got that right. I think
but not
sacrifice isn't
sacrifice is. I said sacrifice
Yes.
is not. That's the distinction I want to make. Right? Sacrifice is, war is not. Why? Because war, if we do right sacrifice, we don't need degraded war. War is related to value. So war is related to value. So if I have, let's say, an ethnocentric field of value, where my ethnocentric triumph is my value, then we will inevitably have war, right? Because we will have conflict, right, over resource, over, you know, both interior resource over status, right? Status of my religion, status of my geopolitical context, we'll have war. But if we actually can create not just a Bretton Woods context, engineered by Henry Kissinger, which says, let's create supply lines that are dependent on each other, right? And let's create this kind of mutual sense of Sam Harris, you know, well-being, and we're going to all work to support our own well-being. And Yuval Harari, coming from that kind of, you know, subtle materialism, says wars are going to disappear 10 years ago. And it was, of course, wrong, because he didn't actually understand the nature of value. He says value doesn't exist. Sam Harris, in the end, uses terms that claim value, but really they're empty of any kind of actually inherent value. But if I actually get that value is real, then I can have an evolution of value. I can go from ethnocentric value to world-centric value, where we're actually together in the field of value and actually to cosmocentric value. And so that actually it's possible to beat our swords into plowshares, right? As the prophet says, right? And there shall be lo yisagoy goy charev v'lo yimudu od milchama, right? And we will no longer learn the art of war. And as we can get to a place where we're in a shared field of inherent value, and therefore we get to actually funnel and channel our drive to sacrifice into, you know, the sacrifice of the separate self for the sake of realization and enlightenment, the sacrifice of my heart for the sake of intimate emotional depth, the sacrifice of my old conception for a new creative emergence. In other words, we can actually engage in sacrifice, which is sacred, sacrifice, sacred, the same word, and not actually use the distorted forms of war to sate, right, our drive for ethnocentric sacrifice, which is rooted in ethnocentric value. So if the evolution of value, right, actually makes war irrelevant. And those are completely related, right? In other words, the issue of first principles and first values is there a shared field of value. Only if there's a shared field of inherent value can we ever, right, not go to war. So we need a robust shared language of value with multiple values, in which every religion in its world-centric and cosmocentric form has a seat at the table, and we actually create a shared grammar of value as a ground for our diversity, or we can't move. The world then explodes in war. And so war and value, we can't have the conversation about war without having had the conversation of inherent value, which is why with our friend Alexander, and I look forward to talking to him, right? Alexander's fantastic. He's a complete rock star. And Zach and Alexander and I have a dialogue, I think, coming up in your context, but at the core of it is inherent value. And Jim Rutt, right, who kind of my friend Daniel sent me some things. Jim avoids the issue of inherent value. You can't have this conversation about war. I apologize for being kind of dramatic about it, right? But it's just like I've seen so many people die. You can't have a conversation about war unless we're willing to have a conversation about value, and only a cosmocentric field of shared value can end war, but that can end war.
Well, okay, so there are a lot of things, and I would like to come back. I would like to come back to I would like to come back to inherent value. I tried to frame it differently. So
please,
the issue that I personally have, the issue that I personally have is that, from a certain point of view, the spiritual path is not a nice path, right? I mean, we're not talking about New Age spirituality. We're talking about the real deal. That means looking into the abyss of the soul. It means terror. It means conflict, and it means to deal with all these dark aspects of the human soul and of existence. And if you don't do this, you're not really on the spiritual path. And you could make the case that the spiritual path precisely exists as the ability to look, that dragon in the eye, right?
Yes.
And because if you can't do that, you can't handle your own bioenergy, you can't handle all these aspects of reality. And so we frame it in a kind of way, it's like it's evolution, and we have developmental psychology, and we kind of frame it in nice emergence and transcendence. We frame it in nice sounding words, but it is not nice. Right?
Yeah, I think
it is not nice. So so the point I'm trying to make, as soon as we're talking about an evolution and we're bringing evolution into the mix, which we did partly through Wilber's work, through your work in the 90s and aughts, and you mentioned Andrew Cohen, evolutionary impulse and all of these things. These things are not nice. These are painful. So, but if you want to bring evolution into the mix, it means that things die. Right? Old things die. There's where the self-sacrifice comes in. You have to let go of things. You have to let go of your narratives, of your perspectives, of of worldviews even. And that's painful. And this will never end. So how do you deal and that's what I mean when you stack it on top of each other? How do you deal it when a society moves from one paradigm to another, from one narrative?
Beautiful.
So
beautiful.
And if you look at the past, this was these evolutionary changes were always accompanied by war, and that's the problem.
Yes, that is the problem, and we have to stand against war and actually, articulate this cosmocentric field of evolving values. So let's go slow for a second, because everything you said was so crazy important. But I want to just, with permission, I want to just kind of just go a little bit slow for a second to catch a couple of the key salient points. So one, you say very beautifully, and I couldn't be more aligned with you, Tom, that the ability to transcend, if we can just play with words, to transcend, to end the trance, right, of a prior worldview is a sacrificial act. And that sacrificial act, right, allows me to actually engage and open to a new worldview, right? So A. B, that sacrificial movement is the movement of evolution itself, right? The occasion of evolution is that in some sense, an atom both retains its atomness even as it gives up, right, the exclusivity of its atomness in order to become a molecule. So when Kessler talked about holons, and Jane Smuts even earlier, in South Africa, talked about that great book Holism, right? We talked about it was this early vision of holons. What he's saying is that reality is sacrifice all the way up and all the way down. To say the world is holons all the way up and all the way down is that parts are constantly sacrificing themselves into wholes, which are now wholes. Now they're sacrificing themselves into a larger whole. So we do that in worldviews. You point out very beautifully, which was what I was referring to earlier. That's completely right. But we can evolve worldviews through acts of radical sacrifice, which are radical intimacy with each other and with, right, the emergence of new gnosis, which doesn't devolve into war, right? That's fully possible if we have, and here's the key, a cosmocentric field not only of eternal value, but of a cosmocentric field of evolving value. And as we have to actually know, and you said, the second thing you said was, I also thought was completely beautiful and right, is you said it keeps going. It's on and on and on and on, right? You pointed to the kind of the spiral of evolution that doesn't end. That's absolutely true, meaning the way I've tried to say it in the last years, right, under the guise of David J. Temple these days, but, is eternal value is evolving value. That's a very big deal, right? Evolution is a value of eternity. So eternal value is evolving value. So it's not when I say we get to a cosmocentric field of value, now we have a fixed cosmocentric field of value, which now we have to rebel against in a war in order to get the next place. No, one of the values of the cosmocentric realization is evolution. So the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. And if we as human beings, I think this is the first time in world history, my friend, that we have the capacity as human beings to evolve beyond war. But we can't do it the way that my friend Yuval wants to do it by saying value is not real. Any meaning you ascribe to your life is pure delusion, right? It's all made up. And I'm going to write you some children's stories for books to tell you that value is not real and all stories of value are completely made up. So the only thing you have left is totalitarianism, right? You have to impose value because you can't, as Yuval says correctly, organize society beyond the Dunbar number without shared value. So if there is no intrinsic shared value, you have to impose it. But if you have inherent shared value, so Tom and Mark, and let me get real personal for a second. We Jews, we do that, right? So here we go, right? So let's get real personal. Tom and Mark couldn't create a relationship unless we were internally allured to the same values. So you and me and Andrew and Zak, for example, who just had a phone call a little while ago, and we got a sense of shared value on the call. It's not that Parallax imposed on the Center for World Philosophy and Religion its value. It's that the four of us, as individuated, unique selves, actually felt in our embodiment an allurement to a shared set of inherent value that lived in all four of us, that created a shared space which was completely non-dominating. Actually, what was in the center was not Tom or Mark or Andrew or Zak. What was in the center was value, right? We were in devotion or in desire, right? Allured to value. So once value is inherent, it allures. As long as value is contrived, it's imposed, and you have never-ending war. So, and as you literally can't have the conversation around war without the conversation around, right, this perpetual process of eternal and evolving value. Now, it's completely your turn. So I got to completely pass to you now. But since I know we have 14 minutes, I'm going to ask permission to steal just 2 more minutes to address Kabbalah, and then the rest is with yours. So is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So just I don't want to, because it's such a beautiful So this is like, again, it's hard to talk about these things without trembling, because they're trembling in their nature, right? There's a verse in Psalms about trembling with joy, right? But this is a joyous trembling. So in a word, in every generation, we call the name of God, right? In Genesis text, where Abraham is koreh b'shem Adonai, he calls the name of God, this calling of the name of God. And every generation's name of God is different, right? And so for example, there's a liturgical text that talks about God is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, right? And we should add on the God of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? And so the commentary, the exegetes say, like, isn't it the same God? Like, and they say, no, it's not the same. It is, and it's not. In other words, it's of course the same God. And yet when we call the name of God, we're recognizing, we're understanding, we're deepening. So the God of Abraham is not the God of Isaac. It is, and it's not. And the God, so how do we call the name of God? So one of the things that our pseudo-anonymous, kind of friend, who I'm as you know, we're writing under these days, David J. Temple. So one of the things that David J. Temple kind of whispered to me one night, in a little note, was that we call the name of God today the infinite intimate. God is the infinite intimate. Now that is rooted in the core Cabalistic notion, the very core. Like if you put a Magnum 357 to my head and said, give me Kabbalah in its essence in 2 minutes, or, Clint Eastwood, make my day, right? So what I would say is that, and it's so crazy beautiful, is that what Kabbalah has this profound realization that perfection, infinity, sacrifices itself, because if we can borrow Blake, because it's in love with the productions of time, meaning infinity desires intimacy. So infinity sacrifices itself. And this was actually Habermas's, the thing that he got. There's this couple of passages in Habermas in passing, which actually I had never seen. And I was sharing with Zak in the early days when we started studying, and I was doing the first Holy of Holies with him. And I shared with him the kind of Kabbalistic notion of tzimtzum, of the sacrificial recoil within the divine. And Zak was reading Habermas then, and he came across this passage in Habermas where Habermas is wildly excited and says, wow, you can't understand reality without this idea of luras in the 16th century, which I had no idea that Habermas was even familiar with. It was very beautiful. So the notion is infinity is madly in love with reality, and love moves me to step back to make room for other, a kind of kenosis, a kind of emptying out, even when other, at least for a moment, chooses against me. All right? So divinity steps back, recoils, divine sacrifice, the sacrificial act of the divine, the infinite sacrifices itself for the sake of the intimate. And all of a sudden, we have the kind of Aramaic Hebrew etymology at play, right? So the sacrificial act and the intimate act are one. And so there's this model, right? This kind of fundamental model of the perfected divine that sacrifices its perfection to allow human imperfection, world imperfection, the imperfection of the manifest, which in moving towards perfection, paradoxically makes the infinite more infinite, the perfect more perfect, which is, of course, logically impossible, but we have a direct realization of. So that's that. I mean, no one's ever asked me that question, but that's the essence of Kabbalah, is that sacrificial act, which is inherent in the word Kabbalah. And Kabbalah means to receive. And so what it means is I'm willing to receive from Tom. I recognize Tom's a unique self. Tom's an irreducibly unique expression of intimacy. And so Tom has wisdom that I, Mark, don't have. Tom has presence I don't have. Tom has some dimension of infinity that exists in the unique configuration of reality having a Tom experience that no matter what I do, I will never have. So therefore, I need to step back and let me listen to Tom, which is a good thing to do right now. right? So that's a sense of where we are. So it's like, wow. So that's like we've got a lot on the table here in terms of war, and I don't think we can have the war conversation without these pieces.
Right. So I don't know if you, so there's Baudrillard, and he uses the word symptom. I don't know if you, it's not symptom, it's symptom. And he
Right?
means things that don't fit really to a current worldview. You know, the phenomenon that doesn't fit, and
Right.
that is able basically to topple narratives and perspectives and worldviews themselves. And so, what you're talking about, I do this, I do understand this, I do understand this by heart. And I mean, my grandfather, to stay personal, was a priest actually. And so and so I get all this. And in my personal experience, you know, when I go into meditation and into transcendence and in these sublime states, or if I have these conversations with you or people, you know, with the shared value system, and I do understand what you're saying. It's not that I'm not understanding, but I have a weird feeling. And my weird feeling is maybe our assumptions of reality are kind of skewed. And not, I'm not
Say
saying
more. I'm not. Say what you mean.
I'm not saying your presumptions or mine, but generally, like what is the fabric of reality itself? And is it like, oh, we're striving to 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 higher stages of realization or to complexity and unification, or is there another principle at play that we don't really want to look at?
I think it's
And so one last thing to
please,
and so I was
please.
thinking about this. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept of salutogenesis. It comes from medicine and says, well, you're never really healthy, you're never really sick. It's always kind of in between. And so it's called salutogenesis. You know, it's like you have a kind of holistic kind of view on health, basically. And I was thinking, okay, so if we actually look at what's happening now in the world, what's happening for the last 20,000 years, we were really never at peace fully. We were also never really at war completely. So it's like it's a genesis also. It's like an in-between state of what I call a bellum genesis, like bellum from Latin war. You know, it's like we're always in this kind of state where we don't know if our behavior escalates war or escalates peace. And that's the conundrum that we have, that we don't know. But we are in this thing. We don't know. We are hoping for, you know, some sublime, unified, collective state. And we're trying to shift, you know, us all together in this kind of healthy, peaceful direction. But we're still in this game as long as we live. And that's the weird feeling that I have.
Yeah, I have to again, my friend, and this is the third time, and that's completely beautiful. It's why it's worth having the conversation. But I have to again completely and as sweetly and sharply as I can take issue. And I'll just say why. Because you know, Browning, the poet, wasn't wrong when he said a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? Right? If we don't have a vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful, which I don't think is about a constant striving. I think the contra to Sauron, right, in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, is the Shire, right? It's the hobbits in the Shire. It's kindness, it's goodness, it's the delight of conversation, right? It's the bracketing of the self, right, in order to embrace other. It's the fulfillment of one's creative gifts, right? It's gathering around the fire, right? It's dancing, right? You know, when Sam's, you know, kind of at the end of Lord of the Rings, and he doesn't think that he's going to survive, and he's with Frodo, and he says, you know, Frodo says, well, what would you want to do? And he said, I'd like to, you know, go back to the Shire and dance with, I think, Molly, I don't remember her name, but the woman that he marries eventually, right? In other words, there's an elemental sense that we live in a field of goodness, truth, and beauty. We live in a field of value. And value is not hard to find, value is impossible to avoid. And it lives between us and it guides us. And we need a vision of it. We need to be prophets of value, not in the destructive sense, but we need to hold, if we can't hold a shared sense of the end of war, and if we start adopting a position that war is an inevitable characteristic of society, I think we've gone back 400 years before the Enlightenment, right? I think that's actually an extremely, well, yeah, we've gone. There's like a huge no to that, right? I mean, I want right. In other words, we need to actually articulate, a new prophetic vision, which is fully inclusive, a unique self symphony, and yet which has a shared ground of music, which is the music of wholeness. It's the music of shalom. It's the music of peace. And we need to be horrified by war. And I would stand, with mad love, with, in delight of a conversation with you, Tom, but I would stand with all my heart and being against any attempt to normalize war. Right? I don't
Right,
want to
don't get me wrong.
no, no,
I'm not
what I'm
promoting
saying.
war. I'm not doing
No,
all
no,
of
no, I
this. I'm
understand
just
you're not. I don't want to normalize it though. I don't want to
right.
say it's inevitable, right? You're not promoting war. Obviously, you're a man of peace. That's a given. And the goodness and ethic of Tom is beyond. That's not, of course. But there's a normalizing of it. There's a saying this is just the nature of things. No, it's not. Right. The nature of things is, so I'm giving a big counter, but of course we're modeling how we can have a fierce conversation with mad love, right? Which is already a move beyond war, right? In other words, we can have this dialectical, process where we can get to a synergy, but we need to very clearly say war is not the natural human state, right? The natural human state, meaning clarified human nature, right, is tohora tzufa hava. Its insides are aligned with love, are aligned with eros, are aligned with eros value, right? And that saran is a distortion of the shire, right? And Lucifer in the end falls from heaven, right? And anti-value is in the end part of a larger field of value. And that we're not Gnostics with a demiurgus. At best, let's take our friend Alexander, Zoroaster, right, has a larger field of the good. So I think it's critical. I mean, it's a great thing to end on. It's critical not to do anything, because in a certain sense, when we normalize war, we're actually implicitly adopting a postmodern discourse, right, which says that there's no inherent thrust of the field of value, which is the valence of reality, which is filled with valentius, right? Let's use the Latin, with love, right? Moving towards a new kind of shared valor where we get to democratize the hero, and we're all on the side of love together. We're all on the side of love against unlove, right? And I'm going to hold that with all my being.
Oh, I hope you're right. Don't get me wrong. I'm just expressing, this weird
Boy, no,
kind of
totally.
feeling. And maybe just, I mean, there's a joke, and maybe you know this joke. It's about Adam and Eve, in the Garden Eden. And Eve is kind of like so God comes and says, yeah, what's wrong? And you have everything. You have a beautiful husband, everything that you can dream of appears. You are in paradise, basically. And it's beautiful, a land of plenty. And the woman says, it's not enough. And so I always think about this when we were talking about the Shire, and it's like the Shire always makes sense in the context of the Lord of the Rings and the power and the Lords of Power and the war. Otherwise, this island,
right,
that we're all hoping to expand for all humanity, even in the frame of the book, exists only for a short, brief moment of time. And the question is, it's really hard to not to be. I don't want to be flippant about this or anything, because it's such a complicated topic. But do you want to really live in the Shire?
Yes. So I'd say like this, right? This is very, very important. And I know we have to finish here in terms of time, but let me say as follows. It is very, very important. There's a notion in, and you invoked the Cabalistic text. So let me turn to them for a moment with your permission, my friend.
Sure.
There's a notion in Kabbalah, in the very, very esoteric text, called Orot de Tohu, the lights of wild chaos, Bekelim de Tikkun, and the rectified vessels of ethics. In other words, there's a place where actually the Shire comes together, not with Sauron, but with Gandalf and with Aragorn and Arwen, right? And Galadriel, right? In other words, the Shire is not the totality of the Lord of the Rings, right? And in fact, right, that moment where the elven prince stands with the dwarf prince, and he says, God, I can't believe I'm about to die, next to an elf. And the elf says, no, you're about to die next to a friend, right? And it's this incredible. So actually, the Lord of the Rings is not about the Shire, right? It's about this kind of very deep, multi-fabric current of human depth and beauty that actually is willing to unsheath its sword, that is willing to actually engage in what's in every dimension of humanity in order to create heroically, right, heaven on earth. I think we can create heaven on earth, not a false utopia, right? But actually the most beautiful, the most good, the most true world that actually lives inside of us, which is why when we watch Lord of the Rings, no one identifies with the orcs. And even the orcs, last sentence, are fallen elves. The orcs
Well,
were
that's
one,
true.
right? What a pleasure, my friend.
Yeah, well, your words in God's ear, really. I hope we will make it. Sometimes I'm
Yes.
a little bit, I don't know what's happening. Um, but yeah, your words in God's ear,
What
really. Thank
a
you,
great
Mark, so
collection
much
thought.
for doing this. And I know it's a very hard conversation, and that's why I'm doing this, because I'm trying to sort this out for myself, and thank you for so much for taking the time.
Deeply appreciate
And
it, my friend. And I look forward to next time.